Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos. ¿Pudieran decirme si se escucha bien mientras llega Martin? ¿Qué tal, León? ¿Cómo estás? Déjame mandar la invitación otra vez. Ahí está. Vamos a dar un segundito, ya acepté la invitación de Martin. Se escucha mal. Mm, Quizás sea la conexión. Déjenme volver a intentar invitarlo. ¿Está? Puede que sea eso porque, pues bueno, estamos un poco separados hasta Singapur. Ah, ahí está. Martin, how are you doing, my man?
Good morning, Daniel. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's really early for you, right? It's 7 a.m. at Singapore time. Man, you're really
Uh-huh.
far away.
Yeah. It's 7 a.m. Singapore time. So we've been here. I've been here with some colleagues actually for the past 6 days. We've had a bunch of work to do here, but we have been getting up pretty early each day. So I'm used to waking up this time. It's no issue.
Thanks again for taking the time because I know you've been busy. I've been following, and
Yep.
you're doing from the gym floor. I don't recall the name, but it's like a certification from JPS, right?
Yeah, it's our primary education course, so it's called Science to Gym Floor,
Yeah.
and we ran that from Friday all the way through to Sunday. So we had a bunch of students who attended all 3 days. They did level one and level two, so that was really fun. It's cool to have a group of eager students who stick around for 3 days straight. I think that it's a really big time commitment and investment on their behalf. So that was really cool. And we had an additional day yesterday where we were educating another group of coaches. So it's been, yeah, 4 days straight of presenting and interacting with people. And, we love it. It's fun, but it does take its toll. So we're looking forward to a rest day today.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool what you're doing because, well, we're a little, a little bit far away, but all the work that you put out, even from JPS before you join, and now the research that you're carrying out, it really has been of quite the impact in terms of practical applications because I know that you're a fan of physiology, but more so about practical applications, right?
Yes, I love physiology, and I spoke to students about this a couple of days ago. Like I love understanding how things work, and I've dedicated a lot of my study to learning about the human body and its function. But at the end of the day, what we do as coaches, it doesn't mean anything unless it works in practice. Like
Sure.
our, work, happens on the gym floor, and so that's why we've called our course, Science to Gym Floor. It always has to end on the gym floor. And yeah, hopefully today we can speak about some cool science and then bring it back to the gym floor and discuss those important practical applications.
For sure, my man. I'm more than honored and privileged to have you once again. And yeah, for sure, the thing I wanted to talk to you about today is your most recent study, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the first original research. Let's say it's not a meta-analysis, not a systematic
Yeah.
review. It's an RCT, which I found quite
Yes.
interesting because, like you mentioned in said study, it's the first time we see a linear relationship between proximity to failure and neuromuscular fatigue. But not to get too much ahead of myself, I'd like to ask you, why is this line of research of particular interest to you? Like resting reserve, what is failure, and now the relationship within proximity to failure and neuromuscular fatigue. What is it about all these topics that interest you the most?
Yeah. Well, a big part of my PhD is learning about resistance training strategies that can optimize muscle hypertrophy. And one of the specific points of interest is proximity to failure. Now, my end goal over the course of this PhD has been, or at least will be, to look at how proximity to failure during resistance training influences muscle hypertrophy. But because there is a lack of research in this area just generally, and when I say lack of research, I'm referring to studies that utilize proximity to failure in a reliable way that is not only valid in a scientific sense within a study design, but also valid in practice. Because of that lack of research, I needed to take a few steps back and start off by first looking at how proximity to failure influences just neuromuscular fatigue. And now that I've got that set, I can move on to the next step, which is looking more at hypertrophy. Now, you might say that we do have research that shows, pushing to failure causes more neuromuscular fatigue than non-failure training. But as I've discussed in multiple research papers now, a lot of these studies are just comparing, failure versus non-failure groups. And as practitioners, we need to know a little bit more than that. So I'm not sure about you, Daniel, but over the years, I've heard people say that training to failure comes with a disproportionate amount of fatigue than maybe keeping 1 or 2 reps in the tank. Or we may hear that training to failure comes with an exponential amount of fatigue. Now, these claims really, up until the publication of my study, were just founded in assumptions. So it's important to remember that as practitioners and as individuals interested in science, it's fine to make assumptions at times, but we need to be careful with how much confidence and credence we give to some of these assumptions. So my goal was to actually take those claims and test them, right, in a scientific setting with my study design. And it's important to realize that, many assumptions that we've made as a fitness community over the years have been contested by research. And this is why it's important we continue to develop research, because science allows us to refine our claims and adjust our confidence towards them, right? So my goal was to look at these claims, test them, try to quantify the difference between actual proximities to failure, so the difference in fatigue between different proximities to failure, so that we can be a little bit more specific when we discuss this topic, and we can have more confidence in the claims that we are making, and we can now say, well, science has actually tested the effect of training to 3 RIR and 1 RIR and to failure, and it's, we've seen a comparison of emotions, whereas in the past, it was simply a matter of, we've got a non-failure group which is doing 50% of the maximal reps it possibly can, and we've got a failure group, and we're just comparing the two. So hopefully, based on what I've said there, it makes sense why, I've taken that next step, and I've attempted, and I think I've successfully attempted, to design a study that provides us with a little bit more information when it comes to this topic. And really the goal for now, from me, is to take that next step and apply this same thought process to a study design that looks at long-term hypertrophy. So that's where things are at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And particularly, I've been in both sides. I've been the dude that trained in minus numbers for the reps in reserve. I went to failure and beyond every day when I was starting my career. And then I kind of stepped back and how many reps can I leave in the tank? And that leaves us a little bit compromised, like where do we go, right? And it's not a dichotomy that we need to train a failure every time, or it's not also a bad thing to train a failure every now and then. And to have a study that directly measures this, and also in the population that you use, because these are people that know their reps in reserve, that you personally train in JPS, right, in Australia?
Yeah. Yep. So I aimed to recruit resistance trained individuals, and of course that term in itself is quite vague. So I had a specific number of years that participants needed to have trained for, and I also had a strength criteria too. And basically, the end outcome, the baseline participant characteristics were quite impressive, in the sense that this is probably one of the most well-trained samples of participants in this area of research when we're looking at, fatigue responses to resistance training. Now, I also made a concerted effort to recruit females. So most of the studies in this area have been conducted in males, and that's okay, because we can extrapolate from those studies and make some inferences as to how the results may apply to females, but they're not always going to map over each other. So the results that we see applied, the results that we see in men, results we see in women, may not always map over each other. So I made a concerted effort to recruit both 12 males, 12 females. And the cool thing is that the training experience was quite similar across the sexes as well. So the men had 8.3 years of training experience, and the women, it was around 7.2. So pretty similar. They were all training around 4 to 5 times a week. The men had a 1 rep max bench press score of about 116 kilos on average, with the highest going up to 157.5. And the females had a 1 rep max bench press score of about 55 kilos as well, which is pretty good when we look at other studies conducted in females and we make those comparisons. So that was my intent. It was to have a well-trained sample of participants. It was to look at both sexes and potentially explore sex differences as well. And if you've read through the paper, you'll see some reference to sex differences there. And yes, all participants, or at least most participants, were from JPS. So most of them had experience with a personal trainer, which I think is quite valuable, because what this means is that they were competent with the bench press. They were competent with the lift that needed to be executed in the study. So a lot of times we see participants who are unaccustomed or not familiarized to the protocols that the study involves, or at least not familiarized enough, especially for a study that involves training to failure. Participants need to be very competent with the exercise, because as you know, it can be hard to reach that point of failure with good technique. But I think all my participants were in a good place when it comes to competency. And another unique aspect of my sample was that about 96% of the sample had RIR experience. So they had experience predicting RIR in practice, which you can also imagine how that is a great benefit to a study that is actually looking at RIR prediction in a well-trained sample of participants.
Yeah, and there are a couple of questions that I want to ask about what you actually did in the study. And the first one, like you mentioned, which I have it right here also, greater than 120 and 80% body weight for the bench press, which I think is particularly impressive, because at least here in Mexico, it's not as usual, it's not as common for women to train and be strong at the bench press. Perhaps it's a cultural thing. I really don't know. But the fact that you got 12 people that actually are pretty equal in terms of strength, it's really remarkable. You don't see that much in the literature. And also that you included both men and women, because like you mentioned, most studies are carried out in men. And yeah, we can dig into the rabbit hole of sex differences according to the menstrual cycle, which I hope we can do a little later on the discussion. But it's not as much people tend to or like to make it out to be. Like there's going to be significant changes based on hormones, which is really not the case. Like also your study shows, which I think it's also a really interesting finding. But the first thing I wanted to ask you is exactly why the bench press and why a free weight? Because I know, and also the second question, to separate it and not make it confusing, all people did exactly training to failure, right? And then 3 reps in reserve and 1 rep in reserve, right? Which I think it's also a really good thing in your study because all people did pretty much all 3 conditions. And I think that leaves it a little bit more clear for all the possible variation, right? So for the first one, why did you choose the bench press, Martin? Is it easier for
Yeah.
you, or was it easier in terms of you don't want to make people fail in the deadlift or in a
Yeah.
squat or something like that?
Yeah, mostly practical considerations. So I firstly chose a free weight exercise because a lot of the previous research has been conducted in machines, specifically in a Smith machine, which is okay, that's fine. But I think in practice, most of the free weight bench press, at least from what I've observed, is used a little more than the Smith machine, and I didn't want to limit myself to having to use a machine or a Smith machine just because previous research has done so. And we have to consider that previous research has likely used a Smith machine because it's easier to maintain technique and push to failure. But I was confident that I was going to be able to recruit a sample of participants that was competent enough with a free weight bench press to get the job done. So that's the first consideration there. And then secondly, the bench press is an exercise where we can say it's quite safe to push to failure if you're capable of maintaining your technique well across all sets. Interestingly enough, the plan was to also include the leg press into this study design. And I actually did that. It was part of the research proposal. And so in the early stages of conducting the study, I had participants doing both the bench press and the leg press. Now, out of my first 5 or so participants, 4 of them experienced a minor strain or injury on the leg press when they were going through their 1 rep max test or their reps to failure test. And what I had to do was omit the exercise from the study. So I'm highlighting the importance of choosing the right exercises here to reach failure on, not just in practice, but also in research, as I now know. And so the bench press I thought was a safe exercise and all my participants could complete very well. And it was going to be enough to get the results I wanted. But of course, or at least the results that I was of interest in pertaining to the topic I was studying. But of course, that means that the results of the study in general are limited to just the bench press. So something that we have to consider here from the get-go is that what we see in this paper and the results we see in the graphs we see, they're coming from the bench press. And yes, we can extrapolate from that and potentially assume that results may be similar across other exercises, but there likely is going to be some exercise variability, especially if we're going to start comparing the upper body with the lower body. So something to consider there, but still a good first step in the right direction in this realm of research. Daniel, I'm not sure if you read through the whole method section, but that is a long method section because I really tried to set a standard for how this study was conducted so that future research can use it as a platform to build off and look at the leg press and the deadlift and the squat, etc.
I'm not sure if I would participate if you were to train failure on the squat. Maybe if people were yelling and I don't know, with heavy music behind, I could go on, but I can understand the practical implications. And like you said, the method section is one that I wanted to ask you about because I find it particularly interesting. Personally, I'm not as well versed as you are in the literature, but I haven't seen something like this, which is pretty much like people would train with at least with a little bit of experience, but still quite a bit of experience in training, and the way that you actually carry out the study, which, if I understood correctly, was first your 1 RM test, and then 3 separate trials, right? The failure, the 3 reps in reserve, and the 1 rep in reserve. And based on that, I wanted to ask you about what is the definition in the study work? What can we understand as neuromuscular fatigue? Is it related to Henneman's size principle, or how can we make sense of, okay, what is neuromuscular fatigue and how is it gets impacted by proximity to failure?
That's a really good question. So firstly, you're correct in saying that I had three conditions. So my participants all trained to failure, to a 3 RIR, and to a 1 RIR, right, across three different occasions. Now, that was a really good question. So you asked, what is neuromuscular fatigue, right? What is it practically? How can we relate that term? I think that what fatigue actually is, and to me, fatigue is a reversible decrease in force production, right? That's the way that's the way I teach it to students. And what I'm alluding to there is the fact that fatigue leads to a decrease in muscular force production, right? Which means you're not going to be able to produce the force that you otherwise would if you were fresh, but it is reversible. So obviously rest time and recovery time can help reverse that fatigue. Now, in my study, the way that I tested that was via assessing changes in lifting velocity. Now, I'm using the term lifting velocity here to refer to the speed of the concentric portion of each repetition. And this is a very reliable way to measure fatigue in research. And we can also use it as practitioners. We can use it in practice. It's not like we have to be measuring the speed of every rep, but it's something we can look out for. Now, what I did was I compared the lifting velocity with a given load across multiple time points. So Daniel, if I got you into the gym and I put 60 kilos on the barbell and I got you to press it as fast as you could for 3 reps, I could then measure the speed of those reps, right? Now, if I put you through a chest training session, right, and we did 6 to 8 sets of chest training, what I could then do after that session is put 60 kilos back on the barbell, get you to press it again 3 times as fast as you can, and measure the difference in the speed across those 2 time points. Now, the greater the decrease in speed or velocity across the time points, the greater the neuromuscular fatigue being incurred. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense in a practical sense, because when you see
Yeah.
people training through that proximity to failure, you see that velocity loss, which is not intentional, which something came to mind as maybe as a sideway, which is the what's it called, the time under tension discussion, which it tends to be a little silly when people, let's say, pretend, I don't have a better word for it, to slow down intentionally, but when actually counts, when you're talking about real muscle failure, momentary muscle failure, it's that velocity loss which you actually measure.
Yeah, I agree. So I instructed my participants to push as fast as they could off their chest, right? So I wanted them to lift with maximum lifting velocity, and that enabled me to observe a natural decline in lifting velocity as fatigue increased and as the ability of their musculature to produce force decreased towards the end of the set. So I measured fatigue right after the training session. So, like 4 minutes after the training session, and then 24 and 48 hours after the training session as well. And if we zoom out, what that provides us with is a recovery time course, which is plotted quite nicely in the paper. It shows the fatigue that was incurred during the session and obviously right after it, and then how that fatigue or neuromuscular function recovered 24 and 48 hours later too.
Which I find really interesting because it kind of continues the work that you did in your meta-analysis, which we previously discussed. That, okay, we see a linear relationship between neuromuscular fatigue and proximity to failure, but not with muscle gain. Am I getting this right? Like, okay, you can get a greater cost of fatigue, but not more gains. And also other things that you discussed in your study is perceived discomfort. One that I found particularly interesting was muscle damage, that you, correct me if I'm wrong, did see a relationship between it, which is kind of confusing because muscle damage doesn't always correlate with pretty much anything, just maybe discomfort and inability to train properly, perhaps. And that's what I find really interesting. that based on all these results that you've got, we can make better practical decisions that maybe some people experience a greater discomfort, and it's not actually needed to tell these people to go to failure because it's not going to be effective for hypertrophy, taking into account your previous research. That's, I think, the most valuable thing that I personally have learned from this study and the previous one, that you can make decisions based on the individual and get it all together, right?
I think that is a great point, and I really tried to highlight this in the research paper. If you look at the graphs that I have included in the paper, you'll notice I don't just show group averages. So we have to remember that a lot of research findings that we hear about are based on group averages, right? So we've got a group of participants being compared to another group of participants, and we're looking at the average result of each group. Now, of course, that is a reliable way of assessing research findings, and I did that to some extent, but I also tried to show the individual response. So I also plotted the individual graphs. And Daniel, when we look at rating of perceived discomfort in response to a given training protocol, there is a large inter-individual variability, which means that when I put 24 participants through the failure protocol, the perceived discomfort ratings were different, right? Not everyone recorded the same level of perceived discomfort. It varied across individuals. What this means is that we all have a different tolerance to discomfort, and we have to consider that as practitioners when we're working with our programming for the individual client. And it can also prompt important discussions. If we know that a client is not very tolerant to perceived discomfort, then we can speak to them about the importance of not confusing discomfort with proximity to failure and trying to improve their ability to distinguish the two and hopefully improve their tolerance to discomfort over time so that they can get to the point where discomfort isn't clouding their ability to judge their RIRs and to reach true proximities to failure. So I saw individual variability in many of the subjective responses, including perceived discomfort, perceived exertion, general feelings as well. Some people, after training to failure, they rated themselves like a -2 on quite a large scale, which basically indicates like feeling very bad. Other people rated themselves a positive number, and they said they felt pretty good. In most cases, I think that was coming from some of the females I had, which were quite robust, and I trained a couple of the females that I put through the study, and they're machines, so I wasn't too surprised about that. And we also looked at muscle soreness and perceived recovery status. Now, this is where it gets a little more interesting. So I think it's important we appreciate and acknowledge the importance of subjective measures, because in practice, Daniel, a lot of what we do with our clients is subjective, right? A lot of the decisions we make are subjective. Yes, they're informed, but they're subjective. When we speak to our clients and we ask them how they feel before their training session, we're going to experience a subjective response there. And so in research, I don't think we should avoid subjective measures. A lot of people seem to think that maybe objectivity is more reliable and more valid, and maybe there is some truth to that claim, but I want my research to be practically applicable. And so if we do some sort of a subjective activity on the gym floor, then I think it's okay to take that into research and try to quantify it. That's what I'm doing here. Now, what I did was, after the training sessions, when participants were required to come in and test their fatigue, so 24 and 48 hours after the training protocols were completed, I also asked them to rate how recovered they thought they were, so perceived recovery. Now, in some cases, people rated themselves as not being very recovered, so they gave themselves a low rating. Maybe that's because they felt a bit sore, a little bit tired from the session. They gave themselves a low rating. But when we look at the objective measures of lifting velocity, which were my primary measures of fatigue, we actually saw complete recovery in some cases, even when individuals had a low perceived recovery. Right. So what this means is that your perceived recovery doesn't always map onto your objective ability to produce force, right? So your actual recoverability. And I saw this effect take place on the flip side, where some people rated themselves as being completely recovered, but upon getting under the barbell and doing their fatigue test, they were actually slightly fatigued. So I think this gives us some insight into how personal predispositions and traits and stress tolerance can affect one's perception of their own recovery. So in practice, yes, as practitioners, we should be asking our clients how they feel, and we should be using that as a bit of a clue to maybe a clue for any potential auto-regulation, right? But we also have to be a little bit smarter than that and maybe wait until they start lifting. And maybe we can actually observe the speed of the barbell and try to get some more insights into more objective, measures of fatigue, like how does a person feel when they've got a bar on their back? What is the bar speed like during their warm-up sets? Is it moving a little bit slower than usual? So I think that the best step forward, if you're a practitioner, is to understand that what your clients tell you may not always be the truth, whether that be a conscious thing on their behalf or a subconscious thing. And we need to combine both this subjective information with our coach's intuition, and we have to be a little bit more strategic than that and maybe wait it out, put the clients through their warm-up sets first, and try to look at something like lifting velocity to make any decisions as to whether auto-regulation needs to take place.
Man, you touch a lot on a lot of interesting topics that I would love to ask you all of them, but in favor of time, one of the things that you mentioned is objective versus subjective. And I recall several studies that find, like say, an objective measure like percentage 1RM being a little bit troublesome. Let's say people train at their 80% 1RM, which maybe that would be 8 something repetitions. But some people can do 12, some people can do 13. And in spite of being an objective measure, it ends up confusing. And then you have on the other side repetitions in reserve, which is completely subjective, but it can correlate with something like velocity loss. That's, as far as I know, how it's validated. And I think that you mentioned a key point here, that we need to use our intuition and wait until the session happens. Maybe that's the best thing we can do. Maybe it's not, I don't know if it's okay to say, but as scientific as one would like to. But I think based on your research and the things that you're saying right now, I think it's our best chance at auto-regulating in a proper manner to ensure progressive overload happens and also mitigate fatigue. And Martin, one thing that I did want to ask you, like mentioned previously, the difference that you found between men and women, that you already mentioned. One thing that I also happen to see sometimes in my own practice, which is that women sometimes are really machine-like. They don't seem to fatigue, never. They always can do more. Even if her subjective questionnaire said she shouldn't be able to do that, and then you see the girl lifting, and then you go, oh yeah, she could do that. Yeah. So that's exactly what you saw in your study, right? That women recover faster than men. Why do you think this happens?
Yeah. So I do agree. Anecdotally, I've noticed that a lot of my female clients, I've got a lot of female clients who are machines. Like they tolerate a lot of the training volume, and I push them pretty hard, or at least I'd like to think I do. So anecdotally, I have noticed a bit of a sex difference in what we could say is fatigability, and I wanted to explore that in my study. Now, Daniel, you kind of gave it away in the early stages of this discussion, where you said I found like a linear relationship between proximity to failure and fatigue, which means as we get closer to failure, fatigue increases linearly. But when we separate that data and look at men versus women, we see a little bit of a difference, that we actually see a striking difference at some point. And at least it is a difference that we should probably consider in practice. So men seem to accumulate a disproportionate amount of fatigue when reaching failure versus women. So the females, as they got closer to failure, their fatigue response was just linear. Actually looked quite neat. So it looked like that. Whereas when the males approached failure, it was more of an exponential effect. So instead of it being called like a dose response, where it's just like a stepwise increase in fatigue as you get closer to failure and as RIR decreases, it's an exponential dose response for males, or at least it seems to be that way, where you'll get closer to failure, and as you take that step from 1 RIR to failure, it's exponential and disproportionate. So that's the main difference, or at least difference, that the results. And so what I'm saying here is that as the intensity of training increases and as we reach those maximal points of resistance training, so failure in a set, we do see that males incur more fatigue than females. And you have to consider, Daniel, that this is based on a 4-minute rest period. Now, I don't know about you, but I think 4 minutes is quite generous. If we think about standard recommendations, which may be anywhere in between 2 to 5-ish minutes, I think 5 is definitely on the high end there. So I think 4 minutes is quite generous. And with that constrained rest period, we saw that when males were reaching failure set after set, they just didn't have the recovery abilities, right? The recoverability that the females had. So the females didn't experience as much of a drop off in repetitions as well. Obviously, they didn't get as much, they didn't get as fatigued. And I mentioned in the paper that there may be many mechanisms that lead to this effect. I think future research needs to explore these sex differences further for us to know even more. There is a lot of research in this area, but many of the studies aren't as ecologically valid as we would like. What this means is, how are the resistance training protocols designed? Are they designed as if they would kind of be designed in practice? So, in the case of my study, I used a very popular and common exercise. I got the participants to do 6 sets. A lot of us will do anywhere between 5 to 10 sets, I would say, on average for a muscle group. Like, at least from my experiences, if I look at my clientele, 5 to 10 sets at least for a muscle group in a session. So, I was trying to implement what I thought was an ecologically valid protocol, and those were the results that I got. But I think future research can look at sex differences even further. And mechanistically, we spoke about this earlier, Daniel. We spoke about how we both are really interested in mechanisms and physiology, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to try and pinpoint a certain mechanism, because these concepts and these topics are quite complex, right? So these sex differences could be stemming from biological, physiological, morphological, hormonal, maybe behavioral, differences that we see not just across individuals, but across sexes, and it's complicated. So I did allude to some potential mechanisms in the paper, but at this point, I would love to see more research that makes a concerned effort to recruit females. You mentioned the menstrual cycle earlier, Daniel. I think this is one of the reasons why researchers are reluctant to recruit females, is because of the potential effect of the menstrual cycle on their results. But you also mentioned that sometimes the effect that the menstrual cycle has on performance and hypertrophy and strength outcomes is a little overblown. So yes, there is an effect there. We have to consider the changes in hormones across a female menstrual cycle. But for example, in my study, what I did was I got all the females to start the study in the early follicular phase, where the ratio between estrogen and progesterone is at its smallest, and the effects on performance and strength are at their lowest point, right? Basically negligible. And throughout the study, if a female did get her period, expectedly or unexpectedly, and there were symptoms that we thought could affect her performance, we would just delay the sessions. And we did that, and it was fine. And so what I'm saying is that I think researchers can include females into their research down the track, and I'd love to see more of that, and I'd love to see more sex comparisons.
Totally, and it's a really interesting topic because the way that you did, I have it right here also. I was looking for the menstrual cycle considerations. That actually that's the thing I wanted to ask you. You did the study, the training protocol in the early follicular phase. And other variable that you also mentioned is oral contraceptives that were not controlled for because it kind of mimics the early follicular phase, which based on mechanistic evidence, solely mechanistic evidence, would be when women would perform better, which is not always the case. And that's the other thing that I found remarkable in this particular study that you did, because we have now meta-analysis that don't find any significant difference. But regardless, you did the study. I don't know if it was intentional. I assume it was, that you did it in the early follicular phase to at least maybe, I don't know, ensure that the performance from the women in the study would be at their highest, which is, I don't know, kind of a safe measure, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's probably one of the easiest ways to try to control for the menstrual cycle across females, to have them start at the same time point, preferably the early follicular phase, like we've spoken about. If a participant, if a female was amenorrheic, which means she doesn't get her period, so she doesn't experience menses. I had 2 female participants, I believe, who were able to start whenever they liked. And of course, there's oral contraceptives, and we can speak about the difference in the androgen effect, right? The androgenic effect of each oral contraceptive, and this again can become more and more complicated. But if we keep speaking about the potential limitations that can affect a female's participation in research, it's going to be very hard to take those next steps forward. So, like you said, Daniel, females who use oral contraceptives and others who don't seem to have a very different hormonal balance in the earlier follicular phase as well, which is why I didn't control for oral contraceptives, and hopefully it makes sense to people as they read through the paper as to why that is the case. And importantly too, I think I noted down the paper, but recent meta-analyses have looked at the effects of like menstrual cycle phase and oral contraceptive use on exercise performance, and the effects, they seem to be quite trivial, at least at a group level. So again, we're thinking about groups now. So of course, if we look at individuals, some females may experience a larger negative effect, right, than others, but at a group level, things seem to be quite trivial. So I still think there's more research that needs to be done in that area as well. But yeah, definitely prompting researchers in our general field of exercise science to push for more female participation and therefore sex comparisons.
Right, and almost to finish up, I want to be respectful of your time and let you rest finally. What would you think would have been the case if people wouldn't get hurt in the leg press? Do you think fatigue would it be the same response, or do you think it being a lower body exercise, which we assume tends to be more fatiguing, would be exponential instead of linear? Do you think that would have been the case, or based on your intuition and what you actually carry out before the injuries happen?
Good question. So this brings me to this year's study design. So we're going to basically answer that question at some point this year, because I'm running another study looking
Cool.
at hypertrophy now, so an intervention study. And I'm also going to be looking at fatigue. Now, I'm going to be implementing the leg press. And you might ask, well, why am I using the leg press if a bunch of my participants got injured last time? Now, basically, last time, I think the reason participants got injured or at least experienced a muscular strain was because of the very sharp increase in exposure to the leg press. So it wasn't a graded exposure to the stimulus of the leg press because of time restraints. So I had basically had participants come into the gym, and some of them hadn't done leg press in a while, and then they had to do the leg press. And so it was a very steep increase in their exposure to that movement pattern and to the loads that they were lifting. So this time around, we're going to have a familiarization period where participants spend quite a bit of time doing the leg press before the study, so hopefully they don't get injured. And this study will be comparing the participants' legs. So it's a unilateral study design. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be getting one of my participants' legs to be pushing to failure and the other leg to be keeping some reps in reserve. I'm going to be looking at the fatigue cost of both of those conditions, and then also the subsequent hypertrophy that occurs over a 10-week period. So that's in the works for this year. But to answer your question specifically, anecdotally, what I've noticed and what we seem to see in the research is that there definitely is an exercise and muscle group specific effect on fatigue. So because the lower body musculature is quite large and the loads you're lifting are usually higher, and the metabolic stress is usually higher, total fatigue is generally higher with lower body exercises, you could imagine, especially because a lot of them also engage the cardiovascular and respiratory system. I think if my participants weren't to have gotten injured on the leg press, we'd see a similar trend, but I think the magnitude of fatigue would be higher as per the changes in lifting velocity across the 6 sets. So I'm not sure if I can take the answer to that question any further, but I think it would be a similar trend. It would be like a linear effect, linear relationship, but a greater magnitude of fatigue I would expect with an exercise like the leg press, which is quite demanding, as you know, on a whole body level. The last time I did a leg press to failure, I think it put me out for about 10 minutes. So yeah, we'll see. This year's study is going to be interesting. It'll obviously be the single leg press, so the loads won't be as heavy, and maybe we can say it won't be as demanding. But as we all know, if we've done a single leg press, it hurts. And I'm going to have to get participants to push one leg to failure for 10 weeks and see how it goes.
I wish them well. And one metric that would be interesting would be the proximity to failure and the fear of one's demise. Maybe that would be greater in the leg press, and especially with the leg going to failure. So Martin, to finish up and not take any more of your time, and again, thanks for doing this, man. I really do appreciate it. For you, as a researcher, but more so as a practitioner, as a personal trainer, and also as a trainee yourself, what do you think is the most valuable lesson that you learned from this particular study?
The most valuable lesson we probably have already touched on. So appreciating, or at least recognizing and acknowledging the individual difference in one's perception to the responses of resistance training. And when I say responses, I'm referring to the discomfort, right? The exertion, the general feeling, the soreness, the perceived recovery. I think seeing the individual data points really highlighted the importance of using subjective information, because we have to take that into account, but we also have to use our coach's intuition to filter through that and potentially even recognize that what your client perceives isn't always going to map out to what we're going to see in practice. And that's, again, using our coach's intuition to bridge the gap between the objective output and the subjective output that our clients are providing us with. So that would probably be the greatest lesson. And that's definitely something that I've taken into my teaching now. You know, obviously as an educator, something we spoke about at length over the weekend. And yeah, I think if practitioners can understand that there is room for subjectivity. Subjectivity isn't all that bad, right? We need subjectivity to some extent, and a lot of our decisions are subjective, but it's a fine line. And you know, when we can, we should also use objective measures and coach's intuition to integrate the two, and you know, bridge that gap and make good decisions.
That's pretty cool, man. And like I mentioned on the last time we went live, I'll be looking out for that study this year and perhaps to be published next year, right? I'm assuming because
Yeah.
it's quite a slow process, science itself, right?
Very slow process. So yeah, hopefully this time next year we could just book in another Instagram live for 14th of March 2024, because I really hope that the study is published by then. But who knows, we'll see.
For sure, man. And one day we can have you as a speaker, like I mentioned before, here in Mexico. It would be an honor and a privilege. So Martin, thanks for doing this, man. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all the lessons that you gave us. And also thanks for the research that you carry out, which I think it's of great value for us trainers, educators, trainees, all the people interested in making maximum gains. So I hope you get a good rest. I hope you eat well and have a safe trip back home when you get to Australia.
Thank you, Daniel. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, it's a pleasure. I'll continue putting out great research and trying to help the wider community.
Thanks a lot, my man. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Yeah, speak to you soon. Bye.
See you soon.